Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. And here's our next lecture on evolution. This is the first of two lectures on evolution. And I want to emphasize that this one might be a little long, so please feel free to take breaks. You don't need to obviously watch the entire lecture all the way through, but there's a lot of material to cover, so this might take a bit of time. So let's go. Evolution is the study of living things and where they came from. And usually, when you talk about evolution, there's a lot of discussion of Charles Darwin and finches and him traveling around the world. I want to give you a little more perspective on that, but I am going to take a historical approach to try and get you to see what Darwin and other scientists before him and of his time were seeing, and hopefully, in that way, convey how natural philosophers in those days arrived at the idea of evolution as we know it today. The question being asked, of course, is where did living things come from? And through historic time, there have been a number of different suggestions about where living things came from. We've already talked about Plato and Aristotle and their various views on the nature of the universe and the nature of life. Specifically talking about Plato and his idea of forms. And then we've already discussed how Aristotle didn't accept the idea of forms as being separate from physical objects, that physical objects were imbued with form and that physical things had to consist of both form and matter. And in terms of change, Aristotle looked at things as saying that the matter might change. He might eat too much and gain weight. He might not eat enough and lose weight. So the matter is changing, but the underlying form would not change substantively. It would remain constant through time. And so there was always a humanness, an Aristotle-ness that lasted even beyond physical change. Aristotle also reasoned that the universe was eternal. And again, this was reasoning using his Socratic method that we've already discussed. Reasoning that you can't get something out of nothing. You can't be not there and then suddenly be there. So from his perspective, the universe was eternal. And so if we look at living organisms from an Aristotelian perspective, and keep in mind that the universe as we know it is eternal, and that while the matter of these living things can change, you can have a big bison or a little bison, you can have a young bird or an old bird, but their underlying form will not change, then that means that these organisms have been like this for eternity. And so Aristotle organized living things by those principles, the principles of an eternal universe and an uh, uh, unchanging life through time. And so in his Historia Animalium, he goes into some detail and he comes up with what was referred to as a ladder of life, where he ranked inanimate matter and then plants from lower or higher. And then he would throw in mollusks, arthropods, crustaceans, and so on, all the way up to humans, who, of course, were at the top. And as we've already talked about previously, it wasn't just humans at the top, it was certain specific humans who were at the very tippy top. We've already mentioned that Aristotle considered Asiatics and more northern people to be lesser than Greeks because they weren't as advanced. And so it's not just man being at the top, it's Greek men being at the very tip top of the natural world. And this is referred to as the Scala Naturae. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit through the rest of this lecture. At the same time, there were other perceptions of where life on the planet came from. And one of them you may be familiar with. It appears in Judaism, in Christianity, and later in Islam. And it's the idea that the universe was specifically created. It did have an actual point of creation. It was not eternal. And that the creator responsible for that was God. And so this is a different view where there is an actual point of creation of the universe and that God is responsible for imbuing life with with his essence. He said essentially, God is responsible for all living things, and that started at a specific point in time. Even though that's the case, nevertheless, natural philosophers all over were noticing that if you looked at humans, they seem to share an awful lot of features with other living things, with other vertebrates, with other mammals, for example, in terms of their bony structure, their internal organs, and so forth. Even if humans are specially created, nevertheless, they seem to share an awful lot of the natural world with the rest of the natural world. And so as the Christianity and the church became dominant in the Roman Empire, as we've already discussed, and as they incorporated Aristotelian thinking into that, there was a conflict there with Aristotle saying the universe was eternal and the church saying very clearly, no, the universe had to have had a starting point. That said, there were also some points of agreement where the church also accepted Aristotle's teachings that living things through time weren't changing. They were immutable. And so they accepted the idea of the scala naturae, and they added to it. Instead of humans, specifically Greek humans, being at the top, they added God at the very tip top, and then the angels and seraphim and what have you below God, and then humans below that. So in terms of organisms actually on the planet, humans are it. Humans are at the top. But in the overall hierarchy of the universe, including the spiritual universe, it was God at the top. But in this case, because God is at the top and because the universe is his creation and because God is perfect, his perfection means in this interpretation that he cannot make mistakes. And so if he has made this creation, this universe, he can't have made a mistake in that creation. And so the reason in this view that organisms are in this scale is because God wanted them there. He placed them there. He's perfect. And so each organism has its own assigned place in the hierarchy of existence, and it can't move. It can't move up one level. It can't move down one level. It's exactly where it belongs. And that's true for all living things in the universe. As we've already mentioned, Aristotelian teachings coupled with early Christian thought survived the fall of Rome and were spread to Eastern Europe. Western Europe and the East. They were incorporated into Islamic thought and formed the basis of the Renaissance thought that we classically think of as where science really starts to get started. But what I want to start to touch on here is when we talk about the Renaissance and when we talk about the advent of scientific thought or the renewal of scientific thought, usually these are the sorts of names that you hear, and these are the sorts of individuals that are discussed, and it's the kind of research they conducted that everybody talks about with the renewal of scientific thought. What I'd like to emphasize is that at the same time, there's a different group of people who are also making scientific investigations, and they're discovering the principles of a science that we would now call geology. And they're looking at the Earth and trying to figure out how the Earth came to be the way we see it is. And we're going to start with a guy named Nicholas Steno. And he came up with a couple of principles that are going to sound pretty blazingly obvious, and yet at the time, not so much. For example, if you were to look at this stack of pancakes, you can pretty well see that the one on the bottom is going to be the first one put there, and the one on the top is going to be the last one put there. That's just the nature of stacking pancakes. It's the nature of stacking things. And while that seems obvious, and you can test this at home, we have a weekend coming up. Please feel free to make pancakes and stack as many of them as you can. And even if you stack them in batches, the one at the bottom is going to be the first one down. The one at the top is going to be the last one that you set in place. And this is referred to as the law of superposition. And this was important for establishing the relationships of different strata, whether you're looking at layers of pancakes or whether you're looking at layers of rocks. And you can even test this again yourself this weekend. Go ahead and make a, let's make a cake where you have cake batter here. for example, and if you pour it into a baking pan, the pan is there first, right? That's the law of superposition. It really is that basic. It doesn't work if you don't do this. And then if you do something really dumb, I found this picture online. I didn't do this, but if you put a plastic cake pan in the oven and it starts to melt, then the cake batter is going to leak out, and then it is going to fall, and it's going to form a separate layer lower down, but it's going to form a separate layer on a pre-existing surface, in this case the bottom of the oven, in which case the bottom of the oven was there first. It came first. That's the law of superposition. Again, very easy, very obvious, and yet it was Nicholas Steno who first codified that and established this as a physical law. Keeping with the food theme, it's dinner time, so obviously these breakfast pictures are not going to make you hungry at all. But keeping with the food thing, Steno came up with another idea, which you can also test the same way with pancakes or with cake batter. It's that when you take a semi-liquid like this and deposit it, gravity is going to ensure that it ends up being more or less horizontal in shape. And so this is known as the principle of original horizontality. We just saw it a few slides ago, where when you pour cake batter into a cake pan, it spreads out in a horizontal manner. If that cake pan melts and the cake batter leaves it and falls to a lower surface, it doesn't stay frozen or hardened in a vertical sense. It spreads out and assumes a horizontal form. And so, all other things being equal, due to the force of gravity, when you apply a substance like this, be it pancake batter or cake batter or mud, what have you, the principle of original horizontality is going to work, and that you're going to form horizontal layers. With that in mind, let's move on to a different geoscientist known as James Hutton, who looked at these rocks in Scotland. This is a place called Sicker Point in Scotland. And if you look carefully, you can see that these rocks are not horizontal. They very well jump out at you. To the right of center, you've got some layers of rock that are almost up and down vertical. And then over on the left-hand side of the picture, you've got some more reddish sediments that are also not horizontal, completely horizontal. They aren't as tilted as the ones to the right of center of the photo, but they still are not horizontal. And so if you look at these rocks and you map out the layers, you can see that what are referred to here as the Silurian greywacke rocks, the ones that are almost vertical, they had to have been deposited first due to the law of superposition, because the Devonian sandstone rocks on the left, the red ones, are deposited above them. And so you have the Silurian rocks that were deposited, and they had to have been originally horizontal due to the principle of original horizontality. And then they got tilted, somehow they got uplifted, and then the Devonian rocks were deposited on top of those. And they also had to have been deposited horizontally due to the principle of original horizontality. And now they are younger because of the law of superposition. Do you see where that makes sense? And so Hutton is looking at this and saying, what is going on here? And he explains it using Steno's rules, taking what Steno has observed in the present and applying it to past times, to the formation of these ancient rock units. And so Hutton, looking at this, comes up with what he called the principle of uniformitarianism. And yes, you're going to be tested on these, but it's easiest to remember the principle of uniformitarianism as simply being the present is the key to the past. So if we're looking at things that we see happening today, if we are looking at processes that we can see today, like cake batter, like grilling pancakes, we can apply what we observe to past events and explain those events. And so that's the principle of uniformitarianism. So Hutton was able to explain the tilting and relationships of these rocks using Steno's principles. You can also apply those today. This is the Grand Canyon, and you can see that these amazing rock layers in the Grand Canyon are horizontal. that's clearly an indication of the principle of original horizontality. These were laid down, and you can also use the principle of superposition here, where the rocks on the bottom are going to be older than the rocks at the top. And so you have a sequence through the Grand Canyon where the oldest rocks are located at the bottom and the youngest rocks are located at the top, all of them deposited more or less horizontally due to the principle of original horizontality. So Steno's guidelines apply here too, and the river running through it that is carving down through these rocks and exposing these rocks. In most cases, nobody was here to see that, but you can see that same sort of carving of rocks by rivers going on today. And so here's where you can apply the principle of uniformitarianism. The present is the key to the past. So looking at forces going on in the natural world today, you can explain things that you see that happened in the past. This gets back to what we've already talked about with the principle of historical science and applying, in this case, some empirical observations as well. And this brings us to a scientist named Charles Lyell, a very famous British geologist who looked at all these different principles and looked at rock units all over the world. And what he determined was how you can break things out to determine what happened first and what happened later, even if it's not necessarily a straightforward horizontal relationship. And what Lyell determined, and this was important at the time, was that the Earth was far older. In order to account for all of the units being laid down horizontally and then being uplifted and then fractured and then having other layers deposited horizontally on top of them and then having them be interrupted and so forth. By mapping all that out, you could determine that you had to have huge spans of time, over 1 million years, to actually account for all of the different features that you observed in the rock record. And so this was fairly revolutionary. This was the first real indication that the Earth was far older than the few thousand years that were that was a general perception at the time. This wasn't the only sort of scientific work that was going on. Other scientists were investigating other aspects of the natural world, and I want to touch on this one briefly, William Paley, because this has come up a lot, and it may come up again later this semester, where the philosopher William Paley was arguing that nature was designed. And we've already talked about science, how you are not supposed to invoke supernatural forces. It is studying the natural world by comparing it against the natural world. And what we've just talked about with Steno's principles, with Sutton's principles, and with Lyell's observations, these are all clear demonstrations of that, or clear examples of that, where they are trying to explain perceived phenomena using nothing but natural forces and natural explanations. But William Paley takes it in a different direction, in what he referred to as the watchmaker analogy, where if you're wandering through the hills and you find a stone, you don't think anything particularly interesting about that because the hill is made of stones, so it's a natural thing there. If you were to find a watch, on the other hand, that clearly is not a natural feature. It didn't just happen because there's so many little intricate gears and levers and dials and so forth. It cannot have happened naturally, and you can tell just by looking at it that it was designed for a purpose. The same thing would happen today if you were up behind campus and you were walking around and you found somebody's iPhone. You wouldn't assume that it was just a really weird rock. You would know, even if you'd never seen an iPhone or a smartphone before, you would still know that that had a clear design, that it was designed to do something, and that it was not a natural feature. And so what Paley is arguing is that when you see that evidence of design, that it means that there's something else involved. You would recognize that that had to have been designed, and that in turn implies the presence of a designer. And so arguing from that, if we follow that logic, compare the amazing human brain, for example, all of the things that our brain is capable of. That's so much more sophisticated than a simple watch. There's so much more going on. And so from Paley's view, that incredible design implies a designer. And since humans only have God above them on the scala naturae, God has to be that designer. And so here, what Paley is doing is essentially arguing from a logical sequence that God exists, that the designer of the universe is God, and that there's no way to get around that. And that's important because here, contrary to what we've talked about in terms of science being focused on just observations of the natural physical world, here is a logical inference that God does exist, and therefore the potential is there to invoke God as part of scientific explanations. And one of the people who found themselves convinced of this was Charles Darwin, who we've already started to talk about. He wrote that the logic of Paley's natural theology delighted him, and that he was, quote, charmed and convinced of the long line of argumentation. This is what Darwin was thinking as a young man when he started out. And Darwin didn't have a lot of success. He didn't get into medicine. He didn't get into the church. He was kind of casting about, looking for something to do with his life. And so we come to him traveling around the world on the HMS Beagle from 1831 to 1836. It was originally, I believe, supposed to be only about a 6-month voyage, and it ended up taking 5 years. And while he ended up being the naturalist on the voyage, he wasn't originally. He was brought on as the captain's gentleman companion. And that might sound a little unusual today, but at the time, the Beagle had already been out on a mapping expedition in South America. And because of the British naval hierarchy, the captain would remain separate from the crew. He would not dine with the crew. It was all very regimented. And so the captain of the Beagle on that previous voyage was so lonely that he went mad and committed suicide. So the subsequent captain of the HMS Beagle, a gentleman named Captain Fitzroy, decided he wanted to avoid that. He wasn't going to go hang out with the crew. That's not the way the British mind worked. He was going to bring along somebody with him who he could have dinner with, who he could talk to, who he could share views with. And after casting about for a number of people, Darwin is the guy who got the job. And that's why he sailed on the Beagle for 5 years, going all the way around the world, but spending a huge amount of time in South America. And as I've already mentioned, usually with Darwin, you hear about the Galapagos Islands. But before we even get to the Galapagos, Darwin spent a large amount of time in South America. And one of the things he had with him was volume 1 of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, when Lyell argued for the deep age of the Earth, how the Earth was very old, and how it was, that could be demonstrated geologically. And by reading that and then comparing it to what he was observing as he wandered around South America and looked at the rock formations there, he could see those principles that Lyell presented in action. And he could determine how different rock units related to each other. And he could see the great age, the inferred great age of these rocks. He also found fossils, and he noted that there were species of animals on these continents that you did not find on other continents, but that seemed to be related to earlier fossilized forms. For example, he found fossilized remains of glyptodonts, shown here in the upper left, Toxodon in the lower left, and then giant ground sloths like this Megatherium over on the right. And these are all South American animals. And what Darwin noticed is that there's nothing like these animals in the fossil record of England, where he came from. And so he's looking at fossils and recognizing fossils, but seeing a completely different suite of organisms than what you would expect to find in England. And what was interesting is that these extinct organisms appear to have living representatives on the same continent that are also different from organisms that you find on other continents. Now, he was actually wrong about a lot of this, where glyptodonts are not related to armadillos. And Toxodon is completely unrelated to capybaras, and ground sloths are only distantly related to tree sloths today. Nevertheless, this is how Darwin was forming his interpretations, and this led him to think about the relationships of these different organisms. After spending some time in South America, finally the Beagle departs, and here's where we get to the Galapagos Islands. And this is the bay where Darwin and the Beagle landed with Kicker Rock, you can see there on the horizon. And the Galapagos were different from South America because the Galapagos are volcanic islands. And so right at a glance, you can see that geologically, these are very young islands. Now, when I say young, if we look at the Galapagos today, we're still talking millions of years. But while Darwin didn't have absolute ages to pin on these islands, nevertheless, he was able to determine that this was young rock, this was fresh rock, and it was very different from the older rock units that he'd seen in South America. And he also looked at a wild variety of wildlife that was present on the different islands. And one of the things that he did notice is that different islands had different but closely related species. For example, with the giant tortoises, you could look at the anatomical makeup of these different tortoises and figure out that they came from different islands. Different islands had differently shaped giant tortoises. And in fact, the governor of one of the islands even explained to Darwin that if you were to show him a tortoise, he could tell you which island it came from. Now, Darwin is famous for having made the same discovery with finches, but in fact, he didn't notice it when he was in the Galapagos. It was when he was collecting samples and shipping them back to England that the English naturalists there looked at these and realized that the finches from each island were different from the finches from every other island. So they were closely related, and all of them seemed related to organisms from South America, which is quite close to the Galapagos, and yet they were different on each island. But Darwin didn't necessarily see that with the finches. He did see it with the mockingbirds. Even when he was there in the Galapagos, he noticed that the mockingbirds appeared to be related as you moved from one island to the next, but you had different species on each island. And so, and again, all of these species, even though they're different on each island, nevertheless more closely related to species that he'd observed in South America and that had been reported from South America. So with all of this percolating in his brain, Darwin and the Beagle sail away from the Galapagos and resume their trip around the rest of the world. And while they're sailing on the Beagle, Darwin is shifting all this information in his brain and trying to come up with an explanation for the patterns that he'd observed. And so here's what he came up with. And this is the sort of reasoning, again, it is a logical line of reasoning. It holds up. I find it annoying because I would never, ever, ever have gotten there. But I'm not trying to pretend I'm as smart as Darwin. But see if you can follow the logical chain of sequence. If organisms are well adapted to their surroundings, and Darwin observed that, you have some kinds of organisms living in some environments, other organisms living in different kinds of environments. And if an organism is poorly adapted, it doesn't survive very long. So, for example, if you were to take a penguin and drop it in the middle of the Sahara Desert in Africa, it's probably not going to survive because it's not adapted to that environment. What Darwin saw as he traveled the world is that you had organisms that were well adapted to their surroundings, and that poorly adapted organisms would not survive very long. He also had, as argued from Lyell and is confirmed by his own observations, the idea that the Earth is very old. Based on the available rocks that you could see and study, you had evidence that the Earth was very old, and you had evidence that the Earth has changed dramatically through time. Darwin actually lived through an earthquake in Chile. And when he visited the next day, you could see that the rocks had been uplifted and the tide pool organisms that once had been right there on the border of the land and the sea were now completely removed from the sea and weren't going to be able to survive because of that uplift of the rocks. So there you've got two things. Organisms that have suddenly become poorly adapted to their environments because their environments are no longer wet. They've now been removed from that environment, so they aren't going to live long. And that happened practically overnight with just the onset of a single earthquake. So look at this sequence. Organisms are well adapted to their surroundings. Poorly adapted organisms will not survive. The Earth is very old, and the Earth changes dramatically through time. And if you put all of that together, the only logical conclusion that you can reach is that organisms have to have changed through time as well. If the Earth is changing through time and organisms do not change, then they become increasingly poorly adapted and then they die out. And since that's not the pattern we're seeing, it means that organisms have to change through time, which means that the scala naturae is wrong. And so this is Darwin's realization, and it's an important realization. And other scientists, when it was explained to them, immediately picked up on this as well. The idea of a great chain of being where every organism is locked in place relative to other organisms no longer holds up. And if that's the case, you're back to the beginning. Where do species come from? Why do we find species where they are? And so Darwin went back to England. He was done with world traveling, and he started collecting evidence. He started conducting his own tests. He started reading. He started writing to other scientists, and he started trying to put all this together. And he looked at a variety of different kinds of evidence. For example, looking at embryology. And scientists, natural philosophers had already noticed that early embryos, like the top line of this picture, look more or less like each other. And then as they grow and develop, even as embryos, they start to change and they more closely resemble the organism that is eventually going to be born. And so at the earliest embryonic stages, these organisms look very, very similar. And it's only as the embryo develops that you start to see these changes and start to be able to distinguish among different kinds of organisms. You're looking here at fish and salamanders, tortoises, chicks, hogs, and what have you. And they're clearly differentiated on the bottom line, but they're very clearly very similar on the top line of this image. Now, granted, this is a drawing. There's always the potential that somebody might be trying to mislead you and not emphasizing what these differences are. Fortunately, we all live in the 21st century, so we have these things called pictures. And so this is an embryo of a cat, and this is an embryo of a human, and this is an embryo of a dolphin. And you can see that these are actual photographs, and all of these embryos look very, very similar to each other, even though the adult animals that they would have eventually become if you hadn't been taking them and taken pictures of. But had these organisms grown up and become adults, you would have the cats and humans and dolphins, and they would have been very, very different from one another. Darwin also looked at the idea of vestigial organs, organs that appear to be there in animals and organisms that don't appear to serve much of a purpose. For example, this is an ostrich, and ostriches have wings, which, okay, fine. Why do they have wings if they don't fly? Which, by the way, ostriches don't fly. And yes, ostriches can use wings to keep themselves cool, but isn't there some other way to keep cool? Other organisms, including humans, keep themselves cool. We do it by sweating. Dogs do it by panting. Why wings? Why would you use wings to keep yourself cool? And if you didn't need the wings, why would you hold on to them? And so questions like this perplexed Darwin. If you look at things like whale skeletons, here is a whale skeleton hanging up at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. We'll talk about the aquarium a little bit later on in the semester, but this is a whale skeleton at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And what I want you to do is look towards the back end of the skeleton, and you're going to see two little bones hanging there. And those are the hips. Those are what's left of the hip bones of whales. And since whales don't have back limbs and they don't have legs like you and I or other four-footed animals, why would you still have a pelvis? Why would these bones still be in place? Now, it's true that actually the pelvic remains help anchor the genitalia and other parts of the anatomy down there. So they still serve some of a purpose, but why a pelvic bone? Why not anchor the genitalia some other way? Why is it specifically a bone that would have served another purpose in an organism with four limbs? Why is that used here instead of having something specifically designed for that particular purpose. Now, some of you might be sitting there at home kind of sneering and saying, well, how do we know that that's actually a pelvis? How do we know that that's actually the remnant, the vestigial remnant of the hind limbs of whales? And the answer is, I've already shown you this because you saw this embryo. And you can see those little bulges where you have, this is a dolphin, you can see those little bulges where you have the forelimbs and the hind limbs, which actually in the embryo start to form and then are resorbed. The hind limbs disappear, and all that's left is that pelvic bone. And so here you see, again, the embryo starts to form a feature that is not going to appear in the adult. And why should that be? Why would that happen? And some of you are probably thinking, well, duh, it's because of evolution and so on. Remember, nobody's there yet. Nobody has figured this out yet. Darwin is asking these questions, and he's trying to come up with an explanation, a natural explanation that explains all this. He looked at anatomy, and you can look at the bones of your forearm, and if you want to, you can even feel your forearm where you have one upper arm bone, the humerus. You have two lower forearm bones, the radius and the ulna, and then you have a whole bunch of bones in your wrist, and then you've got your finger bones after that. If you were to, don't do this to your cat, because probably they'll scratch you if you do it too much, but even though their forelimbs are very different, they still have that same organization. One upper forelimb bone, two lower forelimb bones, a whole bunch of wrist bones, and then the forepaw and finger bones. If you look at a whale, completely different from cats and humans, and yet it's the same basic components, completely reorganized and readapted in a different format. One upper limb bone, two lower limb bones, a bunch of wrist bones, and then a whole lot of finger bones. Bats, still different, and yet you still have that same pattern. One upper, two lower, bunch of wrist bones, and then your finger bones. So if you have all of these different organisms and they're all doing different things, why have the same underlying structures and then change those structures so dramatically? Even in terms of just flying, look at the different ways that organisms can fly. At the top is a pterodactyl, where it's one of the fingers, the fourth finger, is elongated. Excuse me, in this diagram, it's the fifth finger, is extremely elongated. So, but it still has the one forelimb bone, two lower forelimb bones, bunch of wrist bones, and then the finger bones, but one of those finger bones is enormously long. And then you had a membrane of flesh that stretches out from the body to the tip of that finger. In birds, and you can check this out by eating chicken, you've got the one upper limb, the two lower limbs, you've got the wrist bones, and then you've got what's left of their finger bones that would be what you would call a chicken wing. And then we've already talked about bats having the skin stretched out between the various finger bones. So there's three different ways of flying, and yet they're all utilizing the same underlying components and yet using them differently. And why would you do that? If you want something to fly, if you are a designer and you just want to design an organism to fly, why do it in so many different ways and still use the basic components? What is the reasoning behind that? There's also evidence from biogeography, and this is one of my favorite things of all time. I love biogeography. I could talk about it all day. But what you're looking at in the upper left is a timber wolf skull, and what you're looking at in the lower right is a thylacine skull. And you can see the similarities. Thylacines, also known as Tasmanian wolves. And you can see where the eye is. You can look at the teeth, you can look at the snout, you can look at the shape of the brain case, and you can see that these are remarkably similar. And you're looking at a timber wolf versus a Tasmanian wolf. So we're talking about organisms that share similar characteristics, and they share similar behaviors when they're alive. Thylacines are now extinct, but nevertheless, we do know to some extent what they were doing in life, and there are some similarities with what wolves were doing. And so this convergence of anatomical features makes sense. And yet, when you think about it, the timber wolf is what's known as a placental mammal. Wolves and dogs have placentas, the same as humans do, whereas thylacines, Tasmanian wolves, were actually marsupials. and they're pouched mammals, the way kangaroos and koalas are pouched mammals. And so even though these skulls and these animals are so close to each other in terms of their anatomy, they're wildly different in terms of their relationships. You and your dogs and your cats and your horses and your cows are all more closely related to that timber wolf than that thylacine is. And yet these two look so similar. Why should that be? Why should you, if you want a wolf in Tasmania, you've already got wolves. Put one there. Why have a completely different kind of mammal, completely separate from placental mammals, look like a wolf and behave like a wolf in Tasmania? What sense does that make? And this is another one of the kinds of questions that Darwin and other natural philosophers were trying to address. We've already touched on the fossil records. Darwin actually didn't look at fossils very much. He didn't focus on these very much. But he did notice when he was traveling on the Beagle that he had different fossils in South America from what had been seen in England and Europe when he was looking at fossils there. And it was also increasingly known that the further back you get in time in the rock record, the more primitive the fossils appear. And so the fossil record is also showing a picture here that that argued not only for change through time, but change on different continents as well. There's also evidence from breeding, and Darwin used pigeons to demonstrate this. I'm going to use horses because I like horses. That's what I study, so bear with me. This is actually a picture of Hercules, who's reputed to be the largest horse on the planet. I don't know that that's true. I haven't verified it independently, but I spent $1.50 at the LA County Fair to take this picture, so take it for what it's worth. Hercules is a draft horse, and he was an enormous draft horse, supposed to be the largest horse on the planet. You also have horses like this one, who I would refer to as a more normal-sized horse, and then you have pony-sized horses that are every little girl's dream, and then you have miniature horses like this one. So you have all these different sizes of horses, and yet all of them are the same species. They're all Equus caballus. They're all the same species. And all you're seeing is differences in breeding, where through breeding, through selection, artificial selection, you have some organisms that are selected for large size and some organisms that are selected for small size. And that's all you're seeing here within a single species. And with all this churning around in his brain, Darwin read an essay from Thomas Malthus, a British cleric who studied political economy and demographics. And in 1798, Malthus had tried to explain poverty and famine and war in human populations by asserting that when your population exceeds the resource base, exceeds the availability of whatever your major resource is, then conflict inevitably results. If you are dependent on forests for lumber and you cut down all the forests and you go away and they go away and now you don't have that resource, you're going to devolve into war and famine and disease. We're going to talk about this as well later in the semester because it's an important principle, but this is what Darwin was looking at. And this is where the light bulb went off in his brain. And he applied what Malthus was saying about human populations to natural populations. And one of the things he'd observed is that organisms differ. He'd observed differences between islands. He'd observed differences between individuals on specific islands in the Galapagos. He'd seen the same thing in South America. And so he was seeing organisms that were adapted to their environment. But because organisms have variability, different organisms are going to be slightly, even within one species, they're going to be slightly differently adapted to their environment. And so when he coupled that idea of variation with the Malthus idea of competition for resources, that would result in the selection of some traits over other traits. And so that was his huge realization that we still focus on today, what he called the law of natural selection, distinguished from artificial selection or breeding. This is natural selection, where just because you have variability and because you have limited resources, you're going to You're going to see some organisms better adapted than others, more able to survive than others, and this is what he referred to as natural selection. Darwin was not the only individual to make this discovery. A lot of people aren't aware of another scientist, a much younger scientist named Alfred Russel Wallace, a British naturalist who also conducted extensive field work. He also went to South America, but in his case, he was collecting specimens not just to study them, but also to sell them. Darwin was extremely wealthy, and so he was able to do this without needing to work for a living. Wallace actually had to work for a living, so what he would do is collect multiple organisms, some to preserve and send back to museums and be studied, others to sell so that their feathers and what have you, their skins and feathers could then be used. And so he collected an awful lot of material. He was actually in the Rio Negro River basin for 4 years in, I believe, 1848 to 1852. And after 4 years of collecting and storing everything, he got on board the ship Helen and sailed for England. And after a few weeks at sea, the ship sank and burned down. And so all of his materials were lost. 4 years of collecting, and other than a few things he grabbed at the last minute and a few of his notes, he lost all the remainder of this material. But not being one to give up, after about 18 months in England, he tried it again. And this time, instead of South America, he went to Indonesia. And he started traveling among the islands here. And he started collecting organisms. And again, he's collecting not just for study, but also for sale. And so because he's collecting multiple representatives of these different species that he's observing, he starts to see variation as well. He starts to see the same thing that Darwin was seeing in his travels. He starts seeing ranges of variation within these different organisms. And so what he also noticed is that where you have a species nearby, you will have what appears to be a closer related species. And so he proposed in 1855 that every species has come into existence coincident in both space and time with a pre-existing closely allied species. So here he's arguing for the appearance of species and saying you're going to get a new species very near where an older but very similar species is also located. And then a few years later, thinking about this and lying sick, he also recalled Thomas Malthus and having read Thomas Malthus, the same Thomas Malthus in the same writing that Darwin looked at. And I'm not going to actually read through this for you. You can freeze frame the presentation and you can read it yourself. But this is wonderfully stated because Wallace is saying exactly the same thing that Darwin is thinking. He's saying it later, but he's still coming up with it. And Darwin at this point still hasn't published. It is a struggle for existence in which the weakest and least perfectly organized must always succumb, which means some organisms are going to survive better than others. And through time, that's going to lead to species changing and potentially to the origin of new species. And so Wallace is so excited about this idea, but he's still stuck down in Indonesia. So he wrote to Darwin and asked Darwin what Darwin thought about it. And Darwin realized that this young naturalist was forestalling him, that he'd actually later, but still stumbled upon the same idea that Darwin had been working on ever since he came home from the Beagle. So here, Darwin has been working on this for 20 years, and now Wallace has the same idea. And so after consulting with other friends and naturalists Darwin had in England, the decision was made to present both Wallace's paper and Darwin's paper back to back in 1858 at a meeting of the Linnaean Society in London. And so that's exactly what happened. So even though we think of Darwin today as being the originator of the scientific theory of evolution, nevertheless, Wallace deserves credit as well because he arrived at the exact same idea independently of Darwin, and that's why both of these papers were presented together at the same time. And then the next year, 1859, that's when Darwin finally pulled it all together and he published his book, The Origin of Species. And from this point forward, this is where we start thinking about Darwin's theory of evolution. So how does evolution work? It's pretty straightforward, actually. Individuals of a species differ from one another. Variations can be passed along to one's offspring through heredity. These variations are not always predictable in advance. More offspring are produced than can survive, and you can actually observe this in the natural world. Some variations may enhance the ability of an individual organism to adapt and survive in a given environment. And this is simply differential reproduction. And you can see this in populations of organisms. You can see this in populations of people, where some families will have more children than other families. Some puppies will have litters that are larger than other litters. Some fish will lay more eggs than other fish. And because they lay those, once those organisms hatch, because there's variability, those variations may enhance the ability of one individual organism to survive a little bit longer. An example that I like to use, and this is not mine, this is from a scientist named Richard Dawkins, but he says if you have things like stick insects, you can have insects that don't necessarily look all that much like sticks. But if one insect looks a little bit more like a stick in certain kinds of lighting at certain times of day, it might not be the one that gets eaten by that bird. And it might live just a little bit longer, and it might reproduce one or two more times before it does get consumed. Better adapted individuals are more likely to live longer and reproduce more frequently and successfully, which means that the traits that enabled them to be better adapted are then passed along to future generations. And so this is how evolution is supposed to work. Now, Darwin had a problem, and other scientists of his time also had a problem, because they didn't know how inheritance worked. Now, Darwin did have 10 or 11 kids, so he knew the basics, but in terms of how inheritance worked, he didn't know that, and neither did anybody else at the time. And the prevailing idea in Darwin's day was the idea of blending inheritance, where two parents get together, and then their children are the blending together of their genes, of their blood, if you will, which would imply that if you had a tall man and a short woman, or a tall woman and a short man, and they have children, those children are going to be more average height. They're going to kind of even out and be right there in the middle, kind of the Goldilocks range of having children. And what's interesting, and this gets back to the whole idea of science being a process, but it also gets back to the idea of scientists not necessarily being so focused on theory that the reality that is staring them in the face gets lost. Because naturalists had this idea of blending inheritance, even though you could see that it didn't match reality. You still had tall people, you still had short people, whereas if blending inheritance worked through just a few generations, everybody should have been about the same height. You also had traits that were lost in a given generation that would reappear in subsequent generations. And yet from Darwin's idea, due to blending inheritance, this is the way it was supposed to work, so that within just 2 or 3 generations, everything averages out. And if everything averages out, that doesn't mean that some traits are going to be promoted over other traits. So there's no adaptive advantage that can be passed along to younger generations, which means natural selection won't work. I hope that makes sense. Because Darwin didn't have a mechanism for inheritance, he was stuck. So even though natural selection made perfect sense and a lot of people signed off on it, they couldn't get past the idea of how inheritance worked, because there was this prevailing concept, this dominating concept of blending inheritance, which is wrong, but they didn't know that at the time, and they didn't have a better explanation for how inheritance works. And so this leads to a period of time at the end of Darwin's life in the early 1870s that has been referred to as the eclipse of Darwinism. Because inheritance wasn't understood, natural selection was not seen as working. And so even though Darwin had this great idea at the time, it wasn't seen as the correct answer, because it didn't explain what was the commonly held idea at the time about inheritance. And I think I'm going to end things here. Let's call it off. We'll pick up with this next lecture. If you have any questions on this, again, please feel free to reach out to me. Again, this was a bit of a long one, so I apologize for the length, but there's an awful lot of material to cover. Any questions, reach out. In the meantime, please take care of yourselves. Please stay safe, and we'll talk to you next time.